Welcome to this video. By the end of this video, we'll have our example Nuxt and Storyblok Blog deployed. I will show this at the example of AWS as free, but any static host can be used, because we'll finish this app up, do some nice, fine-tuning steps, and also ensure that we can build our application both in development and production mode, that we can publish our posts on Storyblok. Previously, we only worked in draft mode. Now we will use that publish button up here. And that we also are able to pre-generate the page with this nice generate property in the Nuxt config, where we dynamically fetch dynamic routes. A lot of grounds to cover, so let's dive right into that. So let's start preparing our application for production. First thing I want to do is, in Storyblok, in our blog folder, right now the second post works fine in the preview, right? We see everything the way we wanted to see. However, if I go to our first post, we can't find that page. And the reason for that is that here in the URL, we still have /blog as part of the path. Now we fixed this for the second post by going to the advanced section here and defining a real path, which was just our first post. Now, the problem is that we effectively have to do that for all posts we create, which of course we can do. But of course we can also organize our content differently here on Storyblok to circumvent this issue. Or to be very precise, what I want to do is, we're on the blog path here, so we can go back to our Nuxt project, and in our pages here, we could also add a blog folder here. In that blog folder, we add an index.view file, and we move our _post_id folder into the blog folder. So I'm kind of rebuilding the structure as we structure our content in the content management system on our Nuxt project too. So now we got the pages laid out like this. Of course, this index.view page here in my blog should now receive the content I currently have in my main index.view file. So I'll move that over here. So then now I simply copied the content from the root index.view file into my blog index.view file. And with that, we're fine. We can now still fetch our stories as we did before. We don't need to change that. Now in our main index.view file, I'll also leave it as it is. But the big advantage is that now our blog posts are indeed loaded under their ID as a subpath of our blog folder. So now if I save that and I go to our first post, this now actually works because now our path on the front end includes the blog segment too. And for a second post, I now need to fix this by going to advanced and removing this a real path value. After I hit save there, it now also works. Now, of course, this is only an option if it's fine for you to replicate your backend content structure in your frontend, but you typically want to have these two in sync because the logic by which you structure your content typically is the same. And here I'm perfectly fine with having /blog as an additional path. So back on our page, we can reload the main page, but if I click on a post, this doesn't work anymore because now I obviously need to update my links there. In my post preview component here, there I'm linking to just ID. Now this simply has to be /blog/ and then the ID. So like this. If we add this here and we now reload our main page like that, now we can go to our blog page. And of course, this now all works. If I now go to just blog here, then I'm loading the same page and I can navigate there too. So now this is working. One other thing we could work on is that all posts now brings us back to /blog instead of the root page, even though that's the same here. But if we wanted to fix it, we can go to the header. And there we have all posts. So we could navigate to blog here. One advantage of this technique is that now if I go to a single post, I can force this to be highlighted just as if I'm just on /blog. Because if we inspect this item in the navigation, if I select it here and inspect it, we can see that /blog actually has this nav-link Nuxt.link active class added to the list item when I'm on /blog. And we can take advantage of that. We actually do already do that here. We're assigning our color here, border bottom. I need to adjust this though to not have the exact in it, because I now actually want to color it like this always, even if I'm loading a sub-segment of /blog. So now I'm just removing the dash exact part from my Nuxt.link active or exact active classes. And with that, you can already see now it's marked as active if I'm on a blog post, as well as if I'm on the here are all blog posts page. Now, one other thing we can also notice is that if I shrink this page, the blog posts don't have an equal width. So back to post preview, there on the overall post preview there, we're setting the width to 90% and on bigger screens to 25 rem. Now, theoretically, you would say, this looks good, right? They should all have the equal width. The problem just is that if we go back and inspect this all, we're setting these width settings on the post preview CSS class, which is attached to the article element. However, these articles are wrapped by a link. And that link actually is not a block level element. It doesn't take 100% of the page width. And therefore, the width in here, 90%, refers to the width of our anchor tag, which is an inline element, which is only as wide as it needs to be to fit the content into itself. And therefore, these 90% don't have any effect, at least they're not relating to the page width. So if we want to relate to the page width, we have to ensure that we style these anchor tags differently. And one of the easiest ways of getting the result we want is to simply take our class, which is attached to the article, and simply add it to the Nuxt link instead. If we do that and we save that all and we reload, now we get the style we want on both mobile and desktop devices, because now we're styling this anchor tag differently, and this in the end is the wrapping container holding our whole post preview here. So this also is an important change I definitely want to put into place. With that, our application is taking shape, and now I want to prepare it to get published. Now, to publish the application or our blog, there are two steps which are important. The first step is performed or done on Storyblok. Our posts here, they're still in draft mode. So we can go to a post and click that publish button up here to publish it. That's all. Now you see that this green bullet here is lit up. And I can do the same for the first post. And now this means that we can fetch them on a different API. Instead of fetching our blog posts with the draft version, we can fetch them with the published version. However, I don't want to replace this manually here. Instead, in development mode, I want to use the draft version so that whilst I'm working on my code here, or if I'm spinning the server up to see a preview on Storyblok when I'm drafting posts, that I already see the drafted posts and not just the published ones. If I build for production though, I of course want to use the published version. And now we can take advantage of another feature offered by Nuxt. Nuxt actually tells us in which mode we're running our application. It switches the mode to production whenever we're building or generating our Nuxt project. If we're just running it with the development server in the package.json file, that's the case if we run the dev command, so just Nuxt here indirectly, then we'll be in the development mode. In build and generate, we'll be in the production mode. The generate will become important in a second. So we're in development mode right now, and we can get access to the information in which mode we are through an environment variable that's injected into this build process, so to say, by Nuxt. We access this environment variable in a Node.js style by accessing process env. Now, this is simply a global variable we can access in our build process. It's populated by Nuxt, and it gives us access to an environment property, which holds environment variables, which are set up by Nuxt. And there, on the other hand, we can access the node env environment variable. Now, node env is either production. In this case, I want to switch this to published, or it's not production, it's development, then I want to use draft. So this is one way of getting that version and therefore respecting the environment in which we're running. An alternative is that we can also use the context variable or argument here. I'll show this in the block index here. Here we're fetching the blocks, and I also need to pass the version here. Now we can access context, and there is a isDef property. This is either true if we're in development mode, then I want to use draft, or it's false if we're in production mode, then I want to use published. So just as in my index.view file in the post.id folder, but now with a different approach. Both can be used. This environment variable file is available everywhere. This context-based approach is only available in async data where we get the context. Now, I need to copy that code here into our root index.view file, because here we're also fetching our blog posts, and I'm adding it there too. And with that, we now have a setup that should actually still work fine in development mode. And it does. We can still fetch our content here. Oh, we also need to update this in the About page. There, we also should use that, either the environment variable or context. And with that, we got an application that works fine in development, but that should also work fine in production. And now that's the other part. I want to build this application for production, of course. I want to serve it from a real web host. Now, preparing our CDN links here to fetch the right data is one important step. Another important step, of course, is to simply build and optimize our application. Now, thankfully, Nuxt gives us the entire production build process out of the box with all the optimizations already configured. We don't need to do anything about that. We just have to run a command. And now we actually have two commands for building our Nuxt app. We can either deploy our entire project folder here to a web hosting service that runs Node.js. And then we can run npm start to use Nuxt start indirectly, which will spin up a Node server provided by Nuxt, which will render our pages on the fly. So then we'll have our application on a Node.js server. The alternative is that we pre-generate all the pages so that we can deploy a bunch of static HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files to any static host like AWS S3, like Firebase hosting. This is the approach I want to use, because this allows us to host our application in a very cost-efficient way on hosts that only charge us for actual requests instead of for uptime. So I will quit my development server here, and I will run npm run generate. This will execute this highlighted script here, and now it will try to generate all our routes, like the About page and so on. So first of all, it builds the project, and once it's done building, it renders everything, and we get an error here. Now let's see where this is coming from. If we scroll up, we see for the About page, we get a 404 error, and the same for the just/nothing page. Now, this makes sense, because whilst we did change the version we're fetching, we did not update the token we're using for fetching this. If we go to the Nuxt config, we see we're always using that access token here. Now, that access token, if we go back to Storyblok into the dashboard, this is our preview token, which we can only use to fetch draft versions. Now, we can create a public token for published versions by selecting public in this dropdown and clicking create token. Now, this is the access token we actually have to use to fetch our content in production. Now, of course, we can switch the access token like this. Now, if we rerun npm run generate here, then we still get an error, because the problem wasn't really that token. It was a 404 error, right? Not 401 for unauthorized. Now, that 404 error is also coming from the fact that the About page isn't published. So if we publish it, and then we run this again, and we replaced the token, then we indeed do fetch our content correctly. So let's try this again. Let's see if this now finishes successful. Now this looks better, but of course we have a problem. In the Nuxt config, we hard-coded that production token in there. But if we ever want to test our application again, want to run it in development mode, or maybe just want to spin up the development server for the preview on Storyblok, then this won't work because now we have the publish token, and with that, fetching draft versions will be hard. We can only fetch published versions. So we should go back to the dashboard in Storyblok and fetch our preview token again. And now in the access token field, we actually want to swap that token dynamically. And we can again use an environment variable for this. So again, process nth, and now it's node nth. So that's the same approach we used in the index.view file in the post ID folder. And now we can again check whether this is production, in which case I want to use that production token we just hard-coded in there. Otherwise, I want to use that development token I just fetched again from Storyblok. And now we can try running npm run dev again, and this should now work with the preview token, so with the token that allows us to work with our unpublished posts too. And it should also still work if we generate again. Then it will automatically take that public token, which allows us to fetch published content from Storyblok. And now we have a really dynamic setup where we are using different tokens and different versions for fetching our Storyblok content. Now npm run generate gives us this dist folder, which holds all the content we need to deploy. So we only need to deploy the content of that folder, nothing else, to a web host. However, in that folder, if we watch closely, we got the blog subfolder, which makes sense. But in there, we only got the index.html file. Now, in that index.html file, if we scroll to the right, we seem to have our blog posts in there. That's looking good. But one thing is missing. We don't have subfolders for the individual blog post pages. If we were to deploy the content of the dist folder, we could only directly navigate to the blog root folder here, not to the individual blog posts. We would get a 404 error there because these pages haven't been pre-generated by the generate command. The reason for this is that these pages have a dynamic title, dynamic ID, _post ID. Now, at runtime, when we're clicking around in our Nuxt application and it therefore runs like a single-page application, then this doesn't matter, because then this will be loaded on the fly and rendered in the browser. For pre-rendering, however, so for pre-generating the pages, we need to configure which dynamic pages we have. The problem with that, of course, is how do we know this in advance? We're the developer. We don't know which content will eventually exist. Thankfully, we can fetch the content dynamically from within the Nuxt config. There, we can add a new property, which is called generate. Generate is simply added to the root object in that Nuxt config, and it holds a JavaScript object as a value. Now, in generate, we specify which routes should be generated. For this, we add a routes property in that object, and that in turn holds an array. It can also hold a function that returns an array, by the way. And in that array, we specify which routes, we want to render. Now, we don't know these routes in advance, so we need to dynamically fetch them. For that, I will indeed add a function as a value so that we can execute code here. And now here, I want to actually fetch my routes from Storyblok. I want to find out which posts we have. So to find out, we need to make an HTTP request. And we can do that in Nuxt config. This JavaScript file, which it is in the end, is executed dynamically during the build process. Now for that, I want to use Axios. We can't use the Storyblok API in here in that JavaScript file because it's not part of the Nuxt project. So I will simply import Axios from, and now it's just from Axios like this. We do have that folder in the node modules folder. We should have it there at least. If we go to node modules, you should have this Axios folder because it's a dependency of Nuxt.js Axios of that module. So we're importing Axios here. And now with that in this function, we can use Axios to make a GET request. And now we want to make that GET request to that Storyblok API, to which you can find the URL in the official docs. but the URL is just https://api.storyblock.com/v1/cdn/stories. And here we now need to specify our version, which is published. Here we don't need to switch this dynamically because we'll only run this if we want to publish our application. We'll add a token. That token will be our publish token here, so this first one. So we'll specify this here. And we need to add an extra parameter, CV, for cache version. This should be a timestamp. For that, I'll use the logic the Storyblok SDK uses. You can look up its source code. It's open source. They use a formula which is math floor and then date now divided by 1e3. So this should give us a number which is passed here. This just ensures that we're always fetching the latest version. And I'll add one thing in front of that, and that starts with blog, because we of course only want to fetch the content which is in the blog subfolder. Now this will give us a promise, and in there we get our response, of course. Now that response will hold all the blog posts we have. So now here we can infer which routes we got in the end. So I will return axis get so that this function execution will wait for this promise to resolve. And in here in this then block, I want to return my routes array, which should be rendered. That will be an array. And in there, we just pass a bunch of strings. For example, we have just slash. We want to render the root route. We want to render /blog. And we also want to render /about. So these are the pages it would have rendered anyways, but we specify them again here. But now we can also add our dynamically fetched routes. So we got that in the response data. So blog posts can be fetched from response data. This will be a JavaScript object. And there we'll have a stories property, which holds an array of all our blog posts. And this array is in the end what I want to add here. However, I'll map it because I only need to extract one piece here. So this will be my individual blog post. And I want to return blog post slug. This will just be the URL ID thingy of the blog post. So now we'll return, or we'll get an array which only contains these slugs, so these strings. And I can use the spread operator to add this to my array of routes here. With that, we should have a setup which actually fetches all the blog posts and then returns an array of the routes we want to generate. Let's give this a try by running npm run generate again. We get an error right away. Yeah, we're in a Node.js file, or this JavaScript file is executed through Node.js. So of course here we got axes which we actually require. So like this. So wrong import. This is using Node.js require syntax here because Node.js executes that file. So with that updated import statement up there, let's see if it now works. Still we get an error. Could not resolve routes. Let's see what's wrong. We got a typo in that URL here in the Nuxt config file. There should be a question mark after stories before version because it's the first query parameter. So now with that, if we run npm run generate again, now this is looking a bit better, though we still got errors here for our subpages. This page could not be found. The reason is because we should use the full slug here, full underscore slug. This will include the /blog, so not just a-second-post, which is the slug, but full slug contains the full path, which includes the blog subfolder. That, of course, needs to be added. Sorry about that. So now finally, with that, it should work by using the full path as it is stored on Storyblok. So now with that, if we run generate again, now this looks way better. Now if we inspect the dist folder and go to blog, we see subfolders for the blog posts, and in there we have our pre-populated HTML files. So finally, this is the finished setup. And now we can deploy this. For this, I will use AWS S3, but you can use any static host. S3 is really comfortable or convenient to use though. In there, you simply create a new bucket, something like Nuxt Storyblok YouTube. Choose a region, that should be fine. We can skip the other steps and just click create. Then we can go to that bucket. And now we'll simply upload all the content from this dist folder. So you simply navigate into that dist folder and select all the content which is in there, including the subfolders. So simply click open. And now the subfolders are missing, so let me quickly drag and drop that all in there. It's a bit easier. So all the content, including the subfolders, should go there. Upload it thereafter so that you have the content of the dist folder in that bucket. And now you just need to configure it to serve as a web host. For this, we go to Properties, enable static website hosting. Use this bucket to host a website. Now ensure that you do indeed serve the index.html file as your root document. And we don't have that here, but if you have an error page, you can of course create one. You should point to that here too. Here I'll just point to index.html and hit save. And now under permissions, we need to provide public access to this bucket. We can do this with a bucket policy. There you can click on documentation at the bottom to see some examples, bucket policy examples here. We want to have the read-only permission to anonymous users. Copy that bucket policy here, go back to the bucket and paste it in there. And now example bucket has to be replaced with Nuxt.js/Storyblok-YouTube or whatever your bucket name is, of course. Hit save thereafter. And now we have public access, which is fine, of course. We want to host it. Back on static website, this is the link. If we click on that, we can see our working web page here. And if we reload a page, this will work too, because now we're really just fetching the statically generated content. And this is all. This is all I wanted to show you. This is our very simple blog, which we built with Nuxt and Storyblok finished. Now we have everything in there which we need. We have our content management system, Storyblok, which works headless, which uses an API so that we can get access to the content. And we built a nice front end, which will work like a single page application after the first page load, but which will also take advantage of pre-rendering or pre-generating our pages so that we always fetch the pre-rendered version, which of course is great for a search engine optimization. I hope you liked this and I hope this was helpful. Of course, you can tweak this, adjust the styling, dive deeper, definitely play around with Nuxt and with Storyblok. I hope this gave you some ideas and is something you can use in your next projects. Bye.